listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and today I have a solo episode for you. I'm going to be discussing a few different topics that our advertisers and our buyers have been asking us about. I always like to do episodes around those topics to help just really dive in a little bit deeper into a particular subject and hopefully, just share a conversation about how we're tackling these things in podcast advertising and how we can improve them. So the first bit that I wanted to tackle today was share of voice. What exactly is share of voice? So if you are not familiar, Sounds Profitable has an excellent glossary of terms on their website. I know one of the things that we struggle with a little bit in this industry is making sure that we are all on the same page when we use words and what those words mean. I know words can be hard sometimes, but their glossary is really terrific. And so I'm going to read you what their definition of share of voice is. So they say that it is the percentage of impressions one advertiser receives measured against the total impressions within a specific ad position or an entire episode. If an episode supports up to 4 ads total and a buyer purchases one position fully, they would have 25% share of voice of the entire episode, but 100% share of voice of that ad position. So when we think about share of voice, it's important for us to think about it in the context of dynamic ad insertion, at least for what I'm going to be discussing today, right? If you have a show with embedded ads, you have 4 ad spots, then obviously that's pretty easy because we're just looking at, hey, these are static spots. They're going to be here. They're going to be delivering. And so obviously they are all going to be at that 25% share of voice. And there's really not a whole lot to discuss around that. When we think about the real topic, it is with dynamically inserted ads. And so to dive in a little bit deeper, when we think about share of voice, let's look at it on a per episode basis first. If we're doing dynamic ad insertion and we've got 4 ad spots, like the definition said in that example, just like those embedded, if we're looking at it on an episodic level, it's easy to say that each of those advertisers has a 25% share of voice. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is when we're looking at those ad spots, right? And so within an ad location, what is your share of voice? Now, in order to dissect that a little more, it's important for us to understand the context of dynamic ad insertion and how it works. It is more complicated than I wish that it were, and it can just get a little bit sticky sometimes because it's hard to know exactly when your impressions are going to be delivered. So let's keep in mind that with dynamic ad insertion, we have ad locations and ad markers within episodes within the full catalog of episodes. So let's use an example that you have a podcaster with 100 episodes. And let's say as a dynamic insertion advertiser, you're going to be dynamically inserting your ads across the full catalog of those episodes. What that means is that you should have ads that fall across all 100 of those episodes. Your ads will run within a specific time period based on the flight that you have designed. So perhaps you have created a month-long flight that you're going to run, and it's going to run across those 100 episodes. This is taking into consideration that each of those episodes has an ad marker location. So does each episode actually have an ad mark? And that's an important piece. So whether you're a podcaster or an ad buyer, that's an element that's important to know, right? Like if an episode doesn't have ad marker locations, then no ads are going to get inserted into that episode because it doesn't have ad markers. We do know, though, that over, a catalog of 100 shows, there probably are several episodes that are getting very, very few listens. So when we think about that combined impression number, those impression numbers will most likely fall in the more current episodes because that's when people are going to be doing most of their listening. But within each episode, there are going to be a certain number of ad markers, and those locations would be labeled something like a pre-roll ad, a mid-roll ad, a post-roll ad. But then it's going to get more detailed because is it in position one, pre-roll one? Is it in pre-roll two? Is it in mid-roll one? Is it in mid-roll two? Is it in mid-roll three? Is it in mid-roll four? Right. So those are all of the nuances that we're dealing with. And as an advertiser, if you were thinking about just getting share of voice for just that ad location, then what you would be saying is, I want to buy maybe 50% of ad position one in the mid roll. And that's what I'm interested in buying. That's the share of voice that I want. The challenge is, what exactly is that representing? And when I talk about needing advancements in technology, those are the types of things that I'm looking at, because often all of this is being executed by the hosting provider. And if your hosting provider doesn't have the technology to do these sorts of things, then it's really difficult to execute them. So when we talk about things like frequency capping, which I've talked about on this show, or when we talk about things like share of voice, if the hosting platform doesn't have the technology to say that I only want 25% share of voice in ad position one, how many impressions am I going to deliver? Then it's really difficult. Now, it's not difficult to set it up in a hosting platform to say we want 50% share of voice in ad position one. What's difficult to know is how many impressions that's going to deliver. Is that going to deliver on a show that gets 100,000 downloads a month? Is that going to deliver 1,000 impressions? Is it going to deliver 10,000? Is it going to deliver 50,000? Not likely to deliver 50, but it's hard to say exactly how many impressions that spot is going to deliver. And that's where I think we're having some of the biggest challenges as sellers, is not having those tools to know for sure what those stipulations are going to deliver at the end of the day, right? We know we can put stipulations in place, but we don't know what's going to happen when we put those stipulations in place. But the reason that share of voice is important is because of that ad fatigue or ad load that we're hearing, right? Where it's like, gosh, we're hearing that same ad over and over and over again. And we want to make sure that from a consumer's perspective, that they're not hearing that same ad too many times, because when you're hearing the same ad too many times, it gets overwhelming, right? And nobody likes to hear that progressive ad for like the sixth time in this, one episode, right? It's not appealing. There's certainly a level of diminishing return. So as we think about share of voice, it's really important to think about what it is that we're getting. And my recommendation, if you were considering share of voice, is to consider it episodically and not necessarily on an ad location basis, because I have experienced that most podcasts do not have each episode set up where every episode has these specific ad markers, right? Like maybe one episode has a pre-roll and maybe it has 2 mid-rolls, and maybe the next episode has a pre-roll and it has 4 mid-rolls. And, it can be a little bit different for each episode depending on the context of that particular episode. And so that's why it gets really tricky when we dig into the share of voice on a per ad location basis. But share of voice is a really important piece to consider as you're crafting your campaigns. The next thing I wanted to talk about is how to create episodic separation within advertisers, especially when we're talking about dynamic ad insertion. Again, when it's embedded, it's pretty easy, right? Like you could say, hey, we're maybe going to have a supplement company that's going to run on our Monday episode, and then we're going to have a different supplement company that's going to run on our Thursday. Maybe they're similar products, so they're not necessarily direct competitors, but we don't really want to put the ads right next to each other because the products are too similar. So how can we create episodic separation? And how we create episodic separation is we put that ad in the exact same location essentially when we're setting the campaign up, if we put the ads in the same spot, then they will rotate. And by rotating, they're never going to run in the same episode. So let's say we have position 1 in the mid-roll spot. If we put both of them in position 1 in the mid-roll spot, then the system cannot possibly deliver both of those ads at the same time. Now, every delivery system is going to be slightly different, but that's how we achieve episodic separation, and it's worked pretty well for us. But you also have to think that when you're in that same placement, then you're essentially dividing your impressions in half. So if it's a show that could have delivered 100,000 impressions, now maybe it's only delivering 50,000 impressions because it is rotating with the other. The last topic that I wanted to cover today is the idea of just ad load overall. Are we having too many ads within a podcast, and why are we having too many ads? I do think that there are kind of two camps when it comes to podcasters. There are the podcasters that are like, hey, I want to maximize my revenue. I want to get as many dollars in the door as I possibly can. Let's put 12 ads in this episode, right? And then you have the podcaster who's like, my audience has taken me so long to build. I don't want to overwhelm them. I don't want them to have too many ads. I'm going to put one ad, right? And there's got to be a happy medium in there somewhere. And so for me and for us at True Native Media, we really look at about a minute of ads for every 15 minutes of content. And typically that's fairly comfortable. So if you have like a 60-minute podcast, then you can pretty easily get away with 4 to even maybe 5 ads. And a lot of it is how you have it set up within the podcast as well. We definitely have seen, and I know that Ad Results has put out some great studies that shows that you really shouldn't be running more than 2 ads back to back, because when you run too many ads back to back, that's when people have a tendency to fast forward. So it is really important to look at ad load and make sure that you're not putting too many ads in a podcast, because ultimately it really does hurt the advertiser as well as the content. So it's really important to consider that. As we think about creating successful ad campaigns, there are so many different nuances to consider. And I know some of the topics that I've been talking about today maybe are a little bit more technical than some of the conversations I have, but it's really important to think about these specific strategies and these tools, how they're being used in the industry, and how you as a buyer are applying those to really create success for your campaigns. I hope that this episode has been informative to you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Or if you disagree with me in any way, I am interested to hear about that as well. I hope that you have checked out my YouTube channel. If you have not, please head on over and check out the show on YouTube. Thanks for listening and watching, and we will catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast to Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast to advertising industry.